The shawl was more thread than cloth, by the end, more of her own patient needle than of the mother who had first worn it. And that was the whole of the story. Though the cold court that watched the dread king wrap a washerwoman in his own mantle never did understand it. They kept the tale as the night their lord was made a fool of by a rag, and the woman who would not throw it away. They could not have missed the point more cleanly if they had tried. The point was the mending. The point was always the mending. But to understand how a woman whose only treasure was a thing that could not be sold came to be wrapped, at the last, in the one garment in the kingdom no one had ever been permitted to touch, we must go back to a cold laundry, and a needle going in and out of a frayed green edge, and a woman who had been keeping a dead woman's shawl alive for 30 years. Her name was Iona, and she was the castle's laundress, which in that house meant she was the woman who mended what the great threw away. She was past 58. She had no family left living. Her mother had died of a bad winter when Iona was barely grown, and the only thing the mother had left her was a green shawl, good wool once, soft at the shoulders, and Iona had carried it from post to post, from one cold servant's room to the next, for the whole of her grown life. It had torn the way all carried things tear, and she had mended it. It had worn thin at the fold, and she had mended it. A moth had got at it one spring in a damp attic, and she had mended it. By the time she came up the mountain to the king's cold castle, the shawl was more her own thread than her mother's cloth, and she would sit in the laundry of and shawl was more her own thread than her mother's cloth. And she would sit in the laundry of an evening was more her own thread than her mother's cloth, and she would sit in the laundry of an evening, darning the green edge by lamplight, and the mending of it had become the one fixed act of her day, the way a prayer is fixed, the thing she did that was wholly hers in a life spent wholly in the service of other people's cloth. She did not mind the work, most days. A laundress sees more of a house's truth than the house ever guesses. She sees which linens are torn and thrown, and which are torn and quietly kept. She sees the seams that give way and the seams that hold. She had mended the king's cold castle for a season before she understood what it was she was mending, which was a house that did not keep anything. The deathless, you see, do not mend. They have no reason to. A torn thing is replaced. A worn thing is discarded. An old thing is an embarrassment to creatures who never age. The king's court threw out its cloth the way a snake sheds its skin, endlessly, lightly, without sentiment, and the laundries of that castle received an unending river of beautiful damaged things that no one had bothered to repair. Iona had never, in 4 houses, seen such waste. Whole tapestries, cut down for a fashion, cloaks discarded for a frayed hem, linens good for another 20 years, thrown for a single stain. She mended what she was told to mend, and she watched the rest of it go, and she thought, in the private country of her own head, that a house which throws away everything it has worn is a house that has decided there is nothing it loves. And then there was the mantle. The crown mantle of the dread King Selwyn was the one thing in that whole throwaway court that was not replaced, and it was not replaced because the king would not permit it, and he would not permit it for reasons no one in that house had ever been brave enough to ask him to explain. It was old. It was older than anyone living in that castle, older than most of the deathless court itself. A heavy dark thing, woven in a pattern no living hand remembered the trick of, fraying now at every edge, thinning at the shoulders, the color gone, the color of a long winter. The court whispered about it the way the court whispers about everything it does not understand. Some said it was the cloak he had been wearing when he was turned, 3 centuries gone. and that he kept it out of grief for the mortal man he had been. Some said it was woven of something no living loom could make, and that to let it die was to lose a protection the house depended on. No one knew. The king wore it on the high days, fraying and all, and he had refused, for as long as anyone could remember, every offer to have it replaced. The Lady Vael meant to have it replaced. She was the creature the court expected the king to marry. She was deathless and cold and beautiful the way a polished blade is beautiful, and she had decided, the way such ladies decide, that the mantle was an embarrassment, and that her ascension would be the occasion of its retirement. She had commissioned the new one herself, in private, a heavy thing of black and silver, very fine, very new, very dead. She had also, in the same private season, begun to look with a particular cold eye on the laundress who sat darning a green shawl in the lamplight, because the king had, in the last months, begun to look at the same laundress, and the Lady Vael was not a creature who shared the attention of anything she had marked as her own. She did not yet know about the mantle and the mending. She would. The king had noticed the laundress the way a man dying of cold notices the first warm thing in a room, which is to say, against his will, and slowly, and then all at once. It began with a cloak. A riding cloak of his, a very old one, given up for ruined years ago and thrown, as everything was thrown, only to reappear in his chamber one morning, whole. The tear at the shoulder mended, the hem restitched, the wool brushed clean. He had not asked for it. No one had. He had held it in his hands a long moment, the dead cloak come back, and then he had said nothing, and worn it. And the court had not remarked on it, because the court did not remark on mended things. Then a tapestry, a curtain, a pair of gloves he had loved as a young king and grieved, the way one grieves a small thing when they wore through. They came back, mended, clean, him again. He found her in the end, because a king who is being quietly loved by an invisible hand will find the hand, if only to understand what is being done to him. He came down to the laundry, alone, on a winter evening, and he stood in the warm, damp doorway and watched the laundress darn her green shawl by the lamp. And she looked up and saw the dread of the kingdom in her laundry, and set down her needle and waited. "You have been mending my things," the king said. "I have, Majesty," Iona said. "They were thrown for nothing. A torn hem is not a dead cloak. I could not bear to see them go. It was nothing a needle couldn't answer." "No one has troubled to do it in this house for 200 years, the king said, and there was something strange in his voice, something a laundress who had read 4 houses' worth of powerful men heard clearly. "No one mended them." "No, Majesty," said Iona. "No one did. He came back. He came back the next evening, and the next, the way a creature who has been cold a long time comes back to a fire, and he brought her things to mend, and she mended them, and the bringing and the mending became the fixed habit of the evenings, stacked one night on the last, the way a dry stone wall is stacked, until it was a thing neither of them could imagine the evenings without. He spoke to her, because laundries are private, and a king who has kept his own counsel for 300 years will talk, it turns out, to the one creature in his house, too, taken up with her needle to bother flattering him. He told her, in pieces, the way old things leak, why nothing in his house was mended, that the deathless learned, in their long years, that everything they loved wore out and died, and that the lesson they had taken from it was to love nothing long enough to need to mend it. That he had replaced and replaced and replaced, for 3 centuries, every cloak and tapestry and curtain and glove, until the house was full of new things and empty of kept things, and he had not felt at home in it for 100 years. "And the mantle," Iona said, plainly, drawing her needle through the green. "You did not replace the mantle." The king was quiet a long moment. "No," he said. "Because it is the one thing you kept," Iona said. "And you could not bear to let it go, and you could not bear to have it mended, because mending it would be admitting it was dying. And admitting it was dying would be admitting that everything you have refused to keep is dying too. So you let it fray, and you wore it fraying, and you told yourself that was loyalty." She did not look up. "I have known widows like that, Majesty. They keep the husband's coat in the closet, and won't wear it, and won't give it away, and won't have it altered, and it rots in the dark. And they call it love, and it is not love, it is being too frightened to touch the grief. A kept thing must be handled. A kept thing must be mended. Otherwise you are not keeping it. You are sealing it in a closet and waiting for the moth." The king of that cold house sat in a laundry and heard a washerwoman tell him, to his immortal face, that his 3 centuries of loyalty to a fraying cloak had been cowardice dressed up as love, and the thing that passed through him was not anger. It was the raw relief of being read, at last, by a creature who wished him well and asked nothing for it, and who mended things for a living, and who had, evidently, been waiting for someone to say it to. "Mend it," he said, at last, and the words cost him something, the way true words cost. "If you can, I have not let another hand touch it in 100 years. I do not know if it can be saved." "I will know when I see it, Majesty," Iona said. "Bring it down. A kept thing can bear being handled. It is the sealed things that crumble." He did not bring it down that night, but he brought her, in the weeks after, every other old thing he had sealed away and refused to mend. Gloves, a sash, a child's blanket he had kept from a life so long past he had half forgotten it. And she mended them all, and the bringing was a kind of confession, each old thing a piece of a grief 3 centuries wide, handed across a laundry to a woman with a needle and mended. She did not yet know the lady had begun to watch. Stay with me, dear listener. A kept thing in a court of replacers is also a target, and the cold eye that had fallen on the laundress was not asleep. The Lady Vael understood, with the cold clarity of a creature who has waited a long time for her ascension, that the laundress was becoming a danger. Not because a washerwoman could ever be a rival, the thought was beneath her, but because the king was changing, and the changing was happening in the warm, damp room the lady could not enter, at the hands of a woman who mended, and the lady could feel the match she had been promised softening at the edges, the way a cloak softens when it is mended instead of replaced. She moved, the way cold, beautiful creatures move, without warning and without a witness. It was the shawl she chose, because the lady understood, the way cruel creatures understand, that the wound is the thing to strike, and the wound of the laundress was the green shawl, the dead mother's cloth. The 30 years of needlework she did not for the house, but for herself. Iona came down to the laundry one morning, and the shawl was not where she had left it. She searched. She asked. The girl Bess, the young laundry maid who loved her, was white-faced and would not meet her eye. And then Bess, in a shaking voice, told her where to find it. It was in the main hall, laid out on the high table for the court to see, and the Lady Vael stood beside it in her cold beauty, and the green shawl, the dead mother's shawl, the 30 years of mending, had been cut, with fine shears, all the way down its mended middle, and the patient thread of a laundress's whole life pulled out and tangled on the board like a thing of no value. "A servant's hidden treasure," the lady said, and her voice carried the length of the hall, smiling. Mended past recognition, hardly cloth anymore. One wonders what else the laundress has been keeping that does not belong to her. Let this be a lesson about holding on to rags and calling it love. Iona stood in the doorway of her own laundry and looked at the corpse of the only thing she had of her mother, cut open on the high table for the amusement of the deathless, and the court laughed the small laugh of creatures who have never wanted anything long enough to fear its loss. And the girl, Bess, wept at her shoulder, and the hall was very bright and very cold. I will not tell you she did not break a little, because she did. There is a particular sound a heart makes when the last thing it had of a dead mother is cut open on a table for sport, and Iona made it, standing in that doorway, and it was a small, private sound, and the court did not hear it, because the court did not know how to listen for the things that mattered. But she did not flee, and she did not weep where they could see, and she did not beg. She walked, very slowly, the length of the hall, past the laughing court, past the smiling lady, up to the high table, and she did not touch the ruined shawl. She looked at it the way a woman looks at a body she is leaving at a grave. And then she lifted her head, and she looked at the dread king who was standing at the head of his table with a face she could not read, and she said, in a voice that did not shake, though it cost her everything not to, "Majesty, you asked me once if your mantle could be saved. You did not bring it down. I am asking you now, in front of your court, to bring it down. Let me mend it. Here, now, before the moth takes the last kept thing in this house the way the moth has just taken mine." The hall went silent. The lady's smile thinned. "The crown mantle is the crown mantle is a kept thing," Iona said, and she did not look at the lady, she looked at the king. "And a kept thing can bear being handled, Majesty. You told me you did not know if it could be saved. Let me show you. Bring it down. Let me mend it in front of every soul who has just laughed at a rag, and let them see what mending is, and what keeping is, and what this house has forgotten how to do." The king stood a long moment at the head of his table, looking at the washerwoman who had just had her heart cut open on his board, asking to mend his, and the court watched the dread of the kingdom decide a thing none of them had seen him decide before. "Bring the mantle," the king said. They brought it down. The ancient dark thing, frayed at every edge, thinning at the shoulders, the color of a long winter, laid out on the high table beside the ruined green shawl, and the whole court pressed close to see. Because the mantle was a relic none of them had ever been permitted to touch, and a laundress was about to put a needle into it in front of them all. Iona sat down at the high table, a washerwoman at the king's own table in front of the court, and she took up her needle and her thread, and she turned the ancient mantle in her hands the way a midwife turns a body, reading it, and her face went very still, because she understood, the moment her hands were on it, what the mantle was. Not what the court whispered, not a magic, not a protection. It was a mortal cloth. It had been a mortal cloth, 3 centuries ago, woven by mortal hands, worn by a mortal man on the last mortal day of his life, and the dread king of 3 centuries had kept it, and refused to mend it, and refused to replace it, and worn it fraying, because it was the last thing the mortal man he had been had ever worn, and to mend it would have been to admit the mortal man was dead, and the king had not been able to admit that for 300 years. It was the shawl. It was the same wound. The dread king's mantle and the laundress's shawl were the same garment, cut from the same grief, the last cloth of a lost love, kept past reason, mended past recognition, refused to the moth by sheer stubbornness. Iona's hands did not shake. She had mended her mother's shawl for 30 years. She knew exactly what to do with a kept thing that someone could not bear to lose. She mended it. In the bright, cold hall, in front of the whole assembled court, in front of the lady and the weeping girl, Bess, and the dread king who had not breathed. She drew her needle through 3 centuries of fraying, and the ancient mantle came back under her hands the way a thing comes back when it is finally, after a long time, allowed to be handled. The thin shoulders closed, the edges sealed. The color did not come back. The color of a long winter stayed, because mending does not lie. But the cloth was whole again, whole and soft and wearable, and the relief of it, the sheer quiet relief of a kept thing saved at last, went through the watching court like a draught of warm air. When she was done, she set down her needle, and she laid her hand once on the mended mantle, the way she had laid it on her mother's shawl every evening of her life, and she looked up at the dread king. "There," she said, "it will bear being worn now. That is what mending is, Majesty. Not keeping a thing sealed, keeping a thing alive." The hall did not know what to do with itself. The Lady Vael, at the foot of the high table, watched her new mantle, the one she had commissioned for her ascension, become the most useless garment in the kingdom in the space of an hour. And her cold face was a thing of careful, dangerous stillness. The relief did not last. The world does not let a washerwoman shame a future queen at a high table and walk away clean. The lady moved in the week that followed, and she moved through the household, which was hers, because the court expected her to be the king's, and the guard answered to the court's expectation, and not yet to the king's refusals. The whisper went up, the way whispers go in a frightened house, that the laundress had touched the sacred mantle without consecration, that the mending was sacrilege, that a mortal needle in the crown's relic was a profanation the household could not leave unpunished. The lady did not have to say it aloud. She had only to let the household do what households do when a servant has overstepped the rank of a future queen. They came for Iona in the small hours, 2 of the household guard, and they did not strike her because the lady was too cold for marks and the household too careful. They simply took her mending basket and her needle and the remains of the green shawl she had gathered off the table and folded and kept against all hope, and they stripped her of her post, and they walked her to the gate in the first snow, and they set her on the far side of it with nothing, not even the shawl, which they kept, because the lady had said the rag was evidence of the laundress's theft, and evidence was kept. The shawl was gone. That was the thing. The shawl, the dead mother's cloth, the 30 years of needlework, was gone. Cut on a table, gathered up, locked away as evidence of a theft that had never happened, and the woman who had mended it for 30 years walked down a mountain in the first snow with empty hands and a chest she would not see again. And the only thing she had of her mother was a memory of how the green had felt against her neck, and a thread or 2 of her own work still caught under one nail. The king did not stop it. That was the other thing, and the worse one. The king, cornered for the first time by the household's expectation and the match the court had long since decided on, did not come down the stair in the small hours, did not refuse the guard at the gate, did not call the lady's name. He let his laundress be walked off his mountain in the snow, because he was a creature who had spent 3 centuries fending off every trouble by shutting a door on it. And the match was a door he had not yet learned how to refuse, and so he let the door close on the woman who had just mended the one thing he could not bear to lose, and the gate shut. and the castle went on, and the mended mantle hung in the king's chamber, whole again. And the king sat alone beneath it, and felt the laundry go quiet, the way a room goes quiet, when the one voice that made it a room has walked out of it. A laundress, who has been turned off a mountain in the snow, does not weep on the road if she has been a laundress for 40 years. She finds a roof, and she takes in mending, and she lives, and she does not think about the green shawl, because there is no thinking about a thing like that and staying upright. Iona took in mending, a quiet village far down the mountain, and she sat by a fire that was not hers, and darned other people's cloth, and was paid in coppers. And the women of the village brought her their torn things, because she was the finest mender they had ever seen. And they did not ask why her hands shook, and they did not ask why she darned nothing of her own. She had nothing of her own to darn. The shawl was gone. Word came down the mountain, a fragment at a time, brought by traders on the road, and by servants who had run from the household, that the dread king had refused, at last, to wear the new mantle the lady had commissioned, and worn the mended one instead, fraying no longer. And the court had murmured, and the lady had gone very white, that the household whispered the laundress had bewitched the king with her needle, and the mending was a curse, and the mantle should be burned and replaced, and the match pushed through before the old one did any more damage. That the king had not spoken the laundress's name in the hall since the night she left, but that the girl Bess, the young laundry maid who had wept at her shoulder, had been caught trying to smuggle a folded green rag down the mountain, and been turned off the household for it. And the green rag had been taken back and burned, and the last thread of a dead mother's shawl went up in smoke in a castle yard, while a laundress far down the mountain darned someone else's cloth and did not know. That was the word Iona did not hear, the burning of the shawl. The girl Bess, turned off for the trying, found her way down the mountain on foot, and came to Iona's door in the village, and told her, weeping, that she had tried and failed, and the green was gone now, truly gone, burned, and there was no mending a burned thing, not even by Iona. Iona sat by the village fire with the girl Bess at her knee, and heard that the last thread of her mother was ash on a castle yard, and the small private sound her heart made was the final one, the one after which there is nothing left to break. And she held the girl and did not weep, and thought about the dread king sitting alone beneath a mantle she had mended, in a house that had just burned the only thing she had loved. She did not have to go back. She had a roof and coppers, and the village's torn things, and a girl to look after who loved her. She could darn in the village for the rest of her days, and never climb a cold stair again. She packed her needles. She took the girl Bess by the hand, because a laundress does not leave a weeping girl at a village fire, and she set off up the mountain again, through the snow, with her mending basket and a child of the household at her side, because the truth she had mended into that mantle was worth more than a quiet village, and a burned thing deserves to be mourned where it was burned, and a house that burns a dead mother's shawl is going to learn, from the woman who mended it, exactly what it has done. She walked in at the king's gate at dusk, in the snow, with the girl Bess at her hand, and her mending basket on her arm. And the household guard did not know what to do with a laundress they had walked off the mountain. Walking back in with a child of the house and a basket of needles, they took her to the hall. The hall was full. The Lady Vael at the foot of the high table in her cold beauty. The household ranged along the walls, the dread king at the head of his table beneath the mended mantle, and the whole court assembled to watch the new mantle be presented, and the match be settled, and the matter of the laundress be, at last, closed. The king raised his eyes at her entrance, and the look on his face was the look of a creature who has bolted every entrance he owns and just watched the one entrance he cared about come back up the drive on its own 2 feet, carrying a basket of needles and a weeping child. The lady recovered first. "The profaner returns," she said, smooth and unsurprised, "and she has stolen a child of the household on her way. The guard will—" "She burned my shawl," Iona said, and her voice was plain and did not shake, and she looked not at the lady, but at the dread king beneath his mended mantle. "Majesty, I did not come back to beg my post. I came back because they burned my mother's shawl in your yard, and a girl who tried to save it was turned off your household for the trying. And I am here to tell you, in front of the lady who had it done, that a house which burns a dead mother's cloth to spite a laundress is a house that has forgotten what keeping is, and I will not let it stand. The mantle you wear was mended by the same hand that mended that shawl for 30 years. The mantle lives because I mended it. The shawl is ash because your lady burned it. You cannot have one and burn the other, Majesty. They are the same garment. They have always been the same garment." She set her mending basket down on the floor of the hall, between them, and the girl Bess stood at her side. And the hall held its breath, because the whole court had just heard a washerwoman tell the dread king, in front of his intended, that the mantle on his shoulders and the rag they had burned were the same grief, and that he could not keep the one and let the other go. The king, beneath his mended mantle, looked at the laundress he had let be walked off his mountain, and the child who had been turned off for trying to save a dead woman's cloth, and the lady at the foot of his table who had burned the one to secure the other, and the 3-century habit of locking every door came apart in him, all at once, the way a kept thing comes apart when it is finally, after a long time, handled. He did not argue with the lady. He did not decree. He took the ancient mended mantle from his own shoulders, the mantle no hand but his had touched in 100 years, the mantle a laundress had saved on a high table in front of the whole court, and he came down off the dais, and he stood behind the washerwoman in the snow-damp shawl she had borrowed for the climb, and he wrapped her in it. His own hands, his own mantle, the kept thing given at last to the one who had kept it, and the weight of 3 centuries of dark winter cloth settled around an old laundress's shoulders like the answer to a question the whole house had forgotten it was asking. "This mantle lives because you mended it," the king said, and his voice was rough, and it cost him. And he said it in front of the lady and the household and the court. "Your shawl is ash because I let it be burned, because I was a coward about a door, and there is no mending that, not by your needle or mine. I cannot give you back the cloth. I can give you the cloak off my back, and the house that burned yours to stand in, and the girl who tried to save it a place at your side for as long as she lives. It is not enough. It will not be enough. A kept thing that is burned stays burned, but you wrapped me in mine at my table when I could not bear to touch it, and I am wrapping you in yours at my gate, because I have learned at 300 years old, from a laundress with a needle, that a kept thing must be handled even when the handling hurts, and that the only thing worse than mending a grief is letting the moth take it unanswered." The mantle was around her shoulders. The girl Bess was at her side, weeping. And the Lady Vael, at the foot of the high table, watched her new mantle, her match, her ascension, come apart in front of her in the space of a single sentence, because a washerwoman had climbed a mountain to mourn a rag, and the dread king had chosen the mended over the new. The lady did not wait to be unmade in a speech. She was too proud a creature for that. She looked at the dread king in a laundress's borrowed shawl, wrapped in the mantle she had meant to replace, and she understood, in the cold way a creature understands a thing it cannot change, that the match was done, and the new mantle was dead cloth, and the house had chosen, against all her cold expectation, to keep. She turned on her heel and walked out of the hall, and a handful of her colder ladies trailed after her in affront, and the doors closed behind them, and the household that had answered to her expectation answered, after a long, cold moment, to the king instead, because a household follows the door that stays open, and the door that stayed open was the one a laundress had just walked back through. The court would keep the story afterwards, as the night a rag got the better of a queen. They did not understand the first thing about it, the way a court of replacers never understands a keeper. The mantle lived. That was the first thing. The ancient dark cloth, whole now under Iona's needle, worn on the high days by the dread king, and worn, this was the new thing, by a laundress on the cold ones, because the king had meant what he said about the cloak off his back, and the mantle that had been the last cloth of a mortal man became, in the end, the first warm thing a washerwoman had been given in 40 years of service, and she wore it, and mended it, and kept it alive the way she had kept everything alive, with her needle. The shawl did not come back. That was the second thing, and it stayed the second thing, and it is important that it stayed. The king could not give her back her mother's cloth. No needle mends ash. Iona sat, in the warm, low room that became hers, and darned the king's ancient things, and the girl Bess's aprons, and the household's linens, and there was no green shawl under her hands in the evenings, and the small fixed act of her day was gone, and it did not come back, and the king, who had learned at last what keeping meant, did not pretend it could. He sat with her, instead, in the evenings, the dread king in a laundry, and he brought her the old things to mend, and the mending of them was the new fixed act, and it was not the same, and they both knew it was not the same, and they did it anyway, because a grief that is handled is a grief that lives, and a grief that is sealed is a grief that rots. You mended my mantle on a table in front of my court, the king said to her once, in the late quiet, the needle going in and out of an old glove between them, and I let them burn your shawl for it. I have been a king for 300 years, and I have never once, in all of it, been shown my own cowardice as plainly as by a woman who climbed a mountain to mourn a rag I let them burn. It was not a rag, Majesty, Iona said, and her voice was very even, because the grief was handled now, and a handled grief can be spoken of. It was the only thing I had of my mother. I mended it for 30 years. It was more my thread than her cloth by the end. And they burned it, and it is gone. And you cannot give it back to me, and I do not ask you to. But you wrapped me in yours, when you did not have to. And the mantle lives, and the girl Bess is safe. And I find that a house which keeps its old things is a house I can sit the evenings in, even with the green gone. I will mend your things, Majesty. I will not mend what is ash. That is the difference, and it is a difference worth keeping. The dread king of 3 centuries, who had replaced every cloak and every tapestry and every curtain in his house for 300 years, because keeping hurt, sat in a laundry with a laundress who had lost the one thing she kept, and felt the thing he had sealed himself against come quietly in at last, through a handled grief, and it was not the loss he had always feared. It was the mending. There is a particular grief, dear listener, in losing the only thing you have of a person you loved, and a sharper one still in losing it to the cruelty of a house that never understood why you kept it. Iona had both, in a single cold season, and the green shawl is ash, and it stays ash, and no needle in any kingdom will mend it back. But she climbed the mountain anyway, with a basket of needles and a weeping girl, and the house that burned her shawl learned, from the woman who had mended it for 30 years, what it had forgotten about keeping. And the dread king took the mantle off his own shoulders and wrapped her in it, not because it replaced what was lost. It did not, and they both knew it did not, but because a kept thing must be handled, even when the handling hurts. And the only answer to a grief the moth has taken is to wrap, at the very last, the keeper in the one warm thing you have refused for 300 years to let another hand touch. There is always one more torn thing worth the mending, you know. And a cold house is warmer than it has any right to be when someone is finally trusted with the needle and the kept thing both. Come back when the lamps are lit and the needles put away. I will mend you the next and tell you who was finally kept warm